So I just wanted to briefly talk about, the format we're going to follow is I'm going to talk a little bit and then Alwan takes over. Basically, I want to start off by talking about why I decided to write, the book as it's written, and I think Ali referred to that in some ways to think about, what was very striking to me post 9/11 when media debates on torture began. There was a constant reference to the return of the unthinkable in the media, right? So for instance, there was this journalist, Jonathan Alter. He wrote in November 2001 that in this autumn of anger, even a liberal can find his thoughts turning to torture, right? And people who were, responding to it, right? The readers who were responding to it, they wrote very passionately, right? And they claimed, and I quote again, that contemplating torture is like going back to the Middle Ages, and how such discussion negates the values on which our civilization is founded, right? And I was really struck by this reference to, the return of the unthinkable, because if you think about, the US, for instance, there is routine violence in prisons in the context of police brutality in immigration centers, in the context of capital punishment, and so on and so forth, right? So violence does take place. How do you kind of pose these two together? The other thing, and one of the reasons I also decided to look at India is because having grown up in India and basically studied political science there, again you saw, how routine torture was, right, in what was brought out in civil liberty reports, right? In theft cases, right, there would be custodial torture and deaths, and if you think about conflict areas, Northeast Kashmir, it was much more, right? And yet that did not seem to affect, the status of India as a liberal democracy, right? So that's really the puzzle that I started off with. One of the things, I realized was that there was always this official claim of denial, right? So either incidents don't take place, or if they do take place, then, so for instance, if you think about when is the turning moment in the torture debate in the US, right, it was when images of Abu Ghraib, appeared in the press, right? Or Kashmir becomes a major issue when mass graves are, they appear and, it's written about in the media to a very large extent, right? So once there is an inability to deny the presence of these acts, right, then they're mostly explained at the level of enforcement, right? And, I want to talk a little bit about how it's, explained away, right? So think about Abu Ghraib. Basically, it was the few bad apple, regardless of the fact that there were memos and documents and so on and so forth, which showed a clear connection between official policy and these acts and practices. So I just want to pause for a minute and show a short clip from Slumdog Millionaire. And this is just the first scene of the film. It's a classic from rags to riches story, right, through winning this game show. But what's very, significant about this particular scene, and that's the first scene of the film, is he's being tortured because they believe he's cheating, right? What was very interesting is that apparently in the first part of the film, or the first version of the film, the officer was actually the person who was doing the torturing. And the Indian government basically protested, and they said that, look, you cannot show a higher ranked official doing torture, right? You can go ahead clearly and show torture, but at least don't show, the high level official. And that's actually really significant, right? Because in a sense, the way in which a lot of the work on torture has been understood, or the problem of torture has been understood, is in terms of policing, right? And that it's a problem at the level of enforcement. There are aberrant officials who are responsible for it, right? And they are usually considered, quote unquote, right, ignorant, illiterate, untrained officials, right? So lack of training was also an issue in Abu Ghraib, if you remember, right? Again, you know, you see this attempt to understand torture mostly at the level of, you know, the lower ranked officials, right? You know, it's also really ironic because if you think about, you know, during colonial times, one of the most systematic reports on torture came out in 1850s. And there, the British, you know, the Britishers had also reached this conclusion that it was the native police, right, who are responsible for torture. That had nothing to do with, you know, maintaining the colonial empire, right? So now it's almost as if, you know, race is being replaced by this class and lack of training distinction, right? That's really, you know, the explanation which is given. And so part of, one of the things therefore I wanted to do is to not look at the problem of torture only at the level of practice, right? Only at the level of enforcement, right? Which a lot of, and basically, a lot of very powerful work has been done by human rights groups and so on and so forth in documenting that kind of a systematic work. But part of what as a political theorist I wanted to do is to think about, you know, do we think of torture as a problem of enforcement, or should we think of it as somewhere linked to the law itself, right? Somewhere is there a space within law, right? Within legal interpretation, within legal cases, within memos that enable some of these practices of torture, right? And that's the reason why I focus on, you know, Supreme Court cases and reports and memos, because that's really used to say, right? That is where the claim is made the most by liberal states that, look, we have strong legal safeguards against torture, right? That is what is used to claim a status of being a liberal state, and that is precisely where I look at in order to actually show that perhaps there is much more ambiguity than has been seen, you know, or focused. And here I do want to emphasize that, you know, one of the, so that I actually try and think of torture as a manifestation of law's tension with violence, right? And I'm going to try and explain what I mean by that, right? And the way I try to do it in the book is to think about how basically states always claim that they use a little form of violence, right? There's always this, so think about death penalty, right? So on one hand, we all think about how, you know, methods of execution have changed from what we think as more barbaric methods, right, quote unquote, to more humane methods, right? So basically, you see a movement from, say, hanging, electric chair, right, to finally saying that lethal injection is so humane that it doesn't even, you know, cause any pain, which is of course belied by, you know, what has been happening in recent years. But if you don't, you know, if you just look at it in terms of the narrative that is given by liberal states, right? That's the argument that over time, liberal states manage to control the more excessive forms of violence and become more humane, right? So part of what I try and suggest is that while that may be true for particularly physical forms of torture, right, there is a range of other violence which has not been addressed, right, which has not been adequately addressed in the cases, in the Supreme Court jurisprudence, right? So that's, you know, and I hope to kind of bring this out more as we talk further. And very quickly, again, I want to emphasize that, you know, this is perhaps both a reaction to what Ali said in terms of, okay, here's the activist and here's the academic, right? I think at the level of, you know, whether you want to call it the academic or the intellectual space where I want to intervene, it is true that one of the things I'm trying to do is to, you know, say that, you know, both theories of state and legal theory have denied the role that violence plays in the functioning of the state, in the functioning of law, right? That is where I'm trying to intervene. With the hope that if we understand, right, or analyze or critique it at this level, then perhaps we are also able to intervene at the level of practices of torture, right? That's where I'm trying to make that intervention. So I'll actually stop here.
Okay, so first of all, thanks to Alwan and to Jeannie for inviting me to this conversation. Over the last month, I've read the book and found it extremely interesting, and I'm going to be reviewing it as well in Hima possibly next month, or it will appear next month or the month after. So, but I think this is going to be more of a conversation, so rather than the book is.
Are you speaking on the mic?
Sorry. So this is going to be more of a conversation than looking at the book in detail. But I just want to kind of reiterate what Jeannie said, which I also got from reading the book. That it most of all to me also comes out with a lot of important theoretical insights about the state. If I got one thing out of the book, I think it's that. And I've always been interested in the state, and it's a great work to kind of engage it through legal discourse, right? To come to an understanding. There are many ways in which we can come to an understanding of the state, and this is a really great entry point through legal discourse to come at an analysis of the state. And because it's grounded in these Supreme Court rulings and so on, it has a certain kind of grounding. We read a lot in terms of theories of the state. Some of it it's not clear, but here it's all so well documented and grounded. And then, as Jeannie said, it also questions this kind of this idea that progressively this kind of torture or violence is being taken away from our social and political life, right? So that it really challenges that. But in other ways, what I found really interesting is a lot of the figures that, particularly in South Asia, that we hear of, people like Bal Gopal, we will talk more about it in the conversation, or Kanagaran. These are very well-known human rights activists, or legal theorists and historians like Upen Bakshi, Ujjwal Singh. It's also engaging with their work, and while Jeannie's doing all this legal analysis, she's drawing from the insights of these amazing activists and intellectuals, and which comes out of their decades of practice, right? And I found that it really brings all of that nicely. Now, having said that about the book, I think Jeannie wanted me here also to see if we can connect this conversation. So this book is mainly about this superpower, United States, the regional hegemon power, India, to this nice little beautiful island called Sri Lanka, where it's mainly known for cricket, and but then we happen to have a state, and maybe that state also tortures, right? So is there a connection, and how can we, in what ways does this book speak to Sri Lanka, or even in terms of my work? And so I'm going to start with a short 3 points that are 3 sort of anecdotes in terms of how I kind of came to think about torture in relation to Sri Lanka. This is way back, the war in Sri Lanka, the armed conflict really started in the late 70s, and I remember as a little boy of 9 or 10, my father was involved in human rights work, and all these white people would come from England and different places, and he'd be taking them out to go meet people, and we'd go around, my brother and I would go around with them for the car ride, and we were supposed to go and stay in some corner or go play with the other kids. And then, but of course, we'll once in a while we sneak in, and once we sneaked and were listening from behind the door, and it's about this man who had been taken in by the military, because by then, the late 70s, the Prevention of Terrorism Act was in place, the military had been sent to clean up, and he had been taken in by the military, and he had been tortured. And I can remember all the things that he was white man about, the needles being put into the nails, being hung upside down, chili powder, all the stuff that that we now know of. But for the first time, I don't think it was just me, right? It happens, police torture was there in Sri Lanka, but for the first time, the middle classes became aware of it when it became the kind of ethnicized issue, right? Where, and that was kind of my first flash, and this is when also kind of all Tamils and Tamil nationalism came to a boiling point because of things like this. And then, fast forward 10 years later, I'm in my late teens, almost 20, and I picked up one book came out, it had come out 5 years earlier, but I read it around 1990, called Pudiyador Ulagam, which translated means a new world. It's unfortunately still not been translated in English. I think it's probably the most important book that came out of the conflict, and it was written by cadres from Plot, which was one of the many militant movements. We all know about the Tigers, but at that time, actually, in the early 80s, Plot was even larger. Cadres, about 30 cadres on the run from Plot. They were Plot cadres on the run, and within a month, while they are on the run, they write this kind of documentary, but it's also with fictitious characters and so on, about what happened to the armed struggle. That they all get joined, then what they see happening, after the 83 riots and when these militant groups mushroomed, that these militant movements started to imitate what the state was doing. So they go through a lot of details about the torture within the militant movements, which was very much like what we had heard about the state. And so they kind of exposed all that was going, that they had gone as young people in their late teens, early 20s, with all these kind of ambitions and aspirations of fighting for their nation, and suddenly they see and these are youthful leaders too, themselves torturing and questioning where this armed struggle was going. And that was also the first time, I think, it really shook me up in terms of all of us, later on I became very critical of Tamil nationalism, but at that time, as a teenager, I was very Tamil nationalist, and this was one of the books that really shook me. But and I think maybe we can talk a little bit more back and forth, and all of you too. But maybe there's something different again, because when you think of torture, you can think of torture as even within the house, right? I mean, domestic violence. Women are tortured day in, day out, and then in a village setting, there are the local thugs who torture. So, but is there something different to torture in relation to the state? Because, as I mentioned, that the most kind of important side for me is the state. And then, kind of the last anecdote is another 10 years later, and a friend of a friend who became a good friend of mine was staying with me here, and he was on the run from Sri Lanka. And he was a long-time Maoist activist in Sri Lanka, and he was taken in by the LTT as a prisoner in the early 1990s. And he was quite a well-known figure in the kind of political circles, so they didn't really torture him in any serious way. They beat him up a couple of times. But he was there, and while he was there in the 1990s, when the IPKF left and the LTT was just beginning to take control of the north and east, and so they had their camps, including their armed camps as well as their prison camps in very residential areas, and he was there. His interrogation was over, and he was being held. And the intelligence wing, which was the kind of the more elite wing of the who carried out assassinations and so on, and the brightest kids were taken in there. Some of those kids used to come, kids meaning they had finished their A-levels, so in the late teens, early 20s, right? They would come and talk to him because they wanted to learn about armed struggles around the world. They were trying to, so he was a prisoner, but they wanted to engage with him. And one day he was sitting with, when he narrated this to me, a very bright young man, probably 19 or 20, and he's talking with him, and suddenly he hears this noise of some guy screaming, and he's startled, and because obviously being tortured, and then this young man in front of him very calmly looks at him and says, "Why are you startled? You know, I bet you are thinking that we claim to be a liberation movement, and this is a residential area, and people are going to hear us, you know, torturing this this guy over there. But you know, what you have to realize is we are not some romantic organization. We want to become a state, and states torture." Right? I mean, that's, I mean, I say that, you know, because, you know, all the militant groups in Sri Lanka were very brutal. I mean, not just in the Tamil community, but even in the south with the JVP, the horrendous violence that is unleashed. But there is something to kind of aspiring to become in a state. And that's how I was trying to think of, which is different from the local kind of mob violence. Right, that it becomes more systematic, and it has to do with what power means, and it's not just about that one person. They want all of society to know, and that's what a state is to be able to govern. So I kind of start with these anecdotes, and I don't want to take too much time, and maybe I can bring in some of the history of what happened to, for example, extraordinary laws. So Sri Lanka is different from India and the US in that for longer part of our post-colonial history, right? Out of our 62 years, we've had more years of emergency rule than not. We've never had a military coup. It's, you know, we've had electoral democracy. Governments have changed. They constantly change, but emergency rule, and that's like what Jeannie discusses in her book. It comes from the Public Security Ordinance, which is kind of a colonial inheritance, 1947, the Emergency Act. And it was first brought about to crush leftist labor agitation. And in 1953, there was a major hartal, which almost shut down the country. It was put in place, then again with the JVP insurrection. But then, of course, it gets used with the ethnic conflict. Similarly, we've had the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which came up about in 1979. And another interesting thing I think they'll come to in the book is this: how these discourses circulate, right? And I think Gina does a wonderful job of showing how extraordinary laws, the Americans are also learning from the Indians. It's not just from the West going that way. In the case of Sri Lanka, Prevention of Terrorism Act was modeled after the British Prevention of Terrorism Act, which was used in Northern Ireland to crush the resistance there. But then it was used in 1979 with the start of the armed struggle, but then it also gets used with the JVP uprising in the south. So one, I think, large theme that maybe we can talk about is, at least for me, in relation to state power and this kind of violence, how it intersects with the margins of the state, right? Both in terms of minorities, in terms of ethnicity, but also in terms of class. And I think it comes out in particularly PUDR's work that you talk about. So those are a couple of themes that come up.
So let me just say which is a central theme both in the book but also in what Ahilan said, which is what has happened in a lot of the torture debates, right, is that often it's thought about as an exception, right? So you use the language of exception quite a bit, right? I'll give you different forms in which it appears, right? So for instance, if you think about how Guantanamo was initially thought about, right? So it was this lawless, the space beyond the law, or if you think about the prison sites, then it's much more about kind of the dark sites, right? So there is a sense in which it was defined as a space where all laws were suspended, right? This Italian philosopher Agamben, right? He became like this, his work became like this catch-all, phrase, or in a sense, even beyond what he was trying to do. I think, he does a more nuanced kind of a theorizing, but it became this phrase that was used all over, right, to suggest that what happened was completely unprecedented, was completely going beyond the law, and so on and so forth. And part of what you actually see is actually, that the memos that came out, particularly in the torture memos, are actually very careful, careful and aggressive usage of hyperlegality, right? So basically, and let me explain what I mean by that. Basically, you interpret the law in such a narrow manner, right, that you almost are trying to basically go against why the law existed, right? So for instance, they do this with the federal torture statute, which was, supposed to be applicable to the torture that was being done to detainees. And part of what they did was to define torture in such a narrow way, right? So think about, organ failure, right, death, and impairment of organs. That was the only thing that was seen as, leading to torture, right? Which to some extent would apply to some of what we talked about in the context of, say, India, US, but also, basically, the brutality that you were talking about, right? I mean, that would get affected by that. But if you think about many of the methods that were being authorized for Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib and so on, right? So stress positions, sexual humiliation, right? Sleep deprivation, environmental manipulation, right? All these methods then, to some extent, fell short of that, right? Making that definition extremely important. Now, this is not to say that the Bush lawyers, the Bybee and John Yoo, did not try to basically go beyond the law, in a sense that basically they were trying to authorize methods, that were not acceptable, right, within US or international law. All it means is that they were trying to use the ambiguities within the law, right, in order to basically allow for many of these techniques, right? And just to give you an example, even though in the 1990s, when the Senate was, for instance, discussing whether they should ratify this UN Convention Against Torture, which then became the Federal Torture Statute, basically they said again that while physical torture, and there they are thinking about, somebody, the most brutal kinds, right? So basically somebody putting spokes in your eyes, right? Or basically electric torture, and so on and so forth, right? Those were consensually seen as torture, right? But when it came to mental forms, there was far less consensus. And they actually talk about, solitary confinement. They talk about sexual humiliation, saying that, okay, we're not sure, right? So there were these ambiguities that definitely informed, right, to some extent what went on during the post 9/11 period. In other words, what the larger implication of that is, and I know I'm going into the details of this, is just to suggest that means even when these more controversial memos were withdrawn or a new regime came into being, right, some of those ambiguities continue to remain, right? So while there may be consensus that physical brutality, you will not find that kind of authorization, right? But the ambiguity, the range of violence that is still accommodated within law remains, right? So the reason, therefore, I think we have to think about how do these terms exception and routine work, right? What is the role that they play in our analysis? And that's very interesting. In the US, as I said, this exception term was used much more post 9/11. In the context of India, in a sense, it's almost like a colonial legacy, right, which suggested always that rule of law, right, rule of law, quote unquote, in the colonial context could coexist with any kinds of extraordinary laws, right? And basically, you always had preventive detention laws. You always had the ability of the executive to basically impose emergency and so on and so forth, which were directly put into post-colonial constitutions. I mean, India even has a provision in the constitution that allows you to introduce preventive detention laws whenever the states see it necessary, right? So there is a sense in which that colonial continuity becomes extremely important and enables, right, the presence of the kind of brutality that we are, talking about, right, at an everyday level.